Today, I'm honored to host a session with Dr. Damian Milton. It's a different session from the rest. It concerns autism and neurodiversity, from awareness to acceptance. Damian Milton works part-time for the Tizard Center at University of Kent as a lecturer in intellectual and developmental disabilities and as a consultant for numerous organizations. Damian also teaches on the MA Education Autism program at London South Bank University and worked on the Transform Autism Education project and a number of projects for the Autism Education Trust. Damian's interest in autism began when his son was diagnosed in 2005 as autistic at the age of 2. Damian was also diagnosed with Asperger's in 2009 at the age of 36. Damian's primary focus is on increasing the meaningful participation of autistic people and people with learning disabilities in the research process, and chairs the Participatory Autism Research Collective. So this is a different event in terms of focusing on neurodiversity, on ways to help people on the spectrum, and also ways using technology, also virtual reality. So we will start with a short video explaining the theories of monotropism and flow states as applied to autistic ways of being, and then an interview will follow looking into the following topics. So there will be a variety of 6 topics: autistic ways of being, neurodiversity and the social model of disability, autism awareness and autism acceptance, the theory of the double empathy problem, working with autistic people, and autism and technology. I would like to mention here that Damian's unique contribution to research has been his paper on the double empathy problem. I don't know if you're aware of that, in 2012, and he's going to give us more information on that straight after the video. So we are ready to go.
Hello everyone, and thanks for coming.
Just a second.
Well, the concepts of monotropism and the concept of flow states, I think, are very much related in a way of conceptualizing the autistic way of being. Monotropism refers to that kind of tendency or strategy of one uses, which is that highly focused, passionate interest, and it's also a way of getting into a kind of flow state, is another way of describing it, because the term flow state refers to a form of kind of optimal experience, as it was described, where one kind of loses oneself in the activity, so sense of self, sense of time, sense of what else is going on around you becomes irrelevant, or your attention is fully taken up in the activity itself. And that relates well to the monotropic perceptual kind of system, as it were. So and being in a flow state can be very beneficial and reduce stress. And this relates to the interest model of autism, or what's called monotropism, which is a theory of autism one tends not to hear as much about, because you have the sort of dominant theories, theory of mind, executive function, and so on. And it was a theory that was devised by an academic who's on the spectrum themselves, Dinah Murray, and it goes all the way back to the 1980s. But it's also been developed by others, especially Wen Lawson. And it suggests the shaping of many cognitive processes depend upon a competition between mental processes for attention, or attention and interest, in a sense, is a scarce resource. And it suggests a kind of spectrum, if you like, of strategies to deal with one's attention, whether someone has any choice in this or not. And monotropism is that highly focused, bit one-tracked, focused in mindset, whilst polytropism is being able to take in lots of different bits of information at the same time and deal with it and respond to it and so on. That in the moment type stuff. If you think of social interaction, where you're listening, talking, looking at body language, and there's other stuff going on, and doing that quickly, that's a kind of more of a polytropic mindset, and it's not something autistic people tend to be very good at. On the other side, though, with activities which require that intense, detailed focus, autistic people often can get very good at things. And this gives an indication, perhaps, of why people on the spectrum show a tendency towards being passionately interested in something or not interested at all, and how that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense as well. And that kind of then leads on to things like spiky profile of abilities, stuff like that. When autism is also often characterised by sensitivity to external stimuli and difficulties processing multiple sources of information, such a strategy, being monotropic, is rational rather than dysfunctional. It's a sensible thing to do. By entering into a monotropic flow-like state, people on the spectrum can gain predictability and control over their immediate environment, get a sense of achievement and in-the-moment fun. So, in a sense, repetitive tasks even for a young child can be extremely rewarding for the predictability. And this is a quote from Dinah Murray. We suggest that the uneven skills profile in autism depends on which interests are being fired into monotropic superdrive, which have been left unstimulated by any felt experience or connection. So, and in a social context, this kind of feedback loop can be very important as well. Experiences of failure or the condemnation and mocking of others can become quite a devastating kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in itself. There's tons of psychology and sociology stuff over the years about this kind of thing. This can be highly influential on which interests are followed through and which are stopped through feelings of fear and anxiety. Anyone here got a pathological loathing of maths? No? That's quite unusual. Must be some background.
Psychology people. Statistics, obviously. Yeah, statistics is good then, yeah.
So, stats you're not scared of.
Yeah.
Trying to think of
This is not a representative sample of people, humanity, I don't think.
Real people. Okay, if you were all in an art class and being judged on your artwork, what would you think?
I'm stressed.
Okay, now we get it. So, you get that kind of mindset can be self-defeating, but it can become incredibly entrenched. So the more experiences of failure, mocking, embarrassment, exposure anxiety, all of these negative stuff, the more likely you're going to be put off from even attempting to do something. And that can end up with like young autistic children by the age of like 6 or 7 going, I hate school, I'm not going in, and fighting their parents at the school gate trying to get away from the place and stuff. So it's quite, can become embedded really quite early on, this kind of avoidance thing. But the opposite can be true as well with that passionate interest. So kind of shapes how one develops. And disruptions to flow can be quite traumatic as well, and lead to sensory overload and fragmentation. And often this disruption can be really quite unwanted and feel quite invasive. And so reactions like meltdowns, shutdowns, panic attacks and stuff, as I'm going into one here, become more likely. So if someone was to have, in that first photograph, stopped me playing with my Hornby railway set, it would have probably really upset me and I'd have got all discombobulated kind of. So that's quite a difficult thing, is moving from one task onto another kind of thing, or can we?
Okay, thank you all for watching. We had some problems with the audio. I'd like to apologize because I think some of you, I get the feedback that some of you weren't able to hear it and some of you heard it double. Unfortunately, I couldn't predict those glitches. Sorry about that. So, Damian, so the first question relates to the concept of monotropism. So how does that concept differ from the dominant theories of autism and autistic cognition?
Well, the reason I wanted to show this clip is around monotropism is that it's a way of looking at autism which is not dependent on seeing autism as just a deficit in comparison to what's considered normal. And as a theory, it came from autistic people themselves, autistic scholars like Dinah Murray and Wen Lawson. And for me, it's a more accurate description of what it's like to be autistic, with less of a value judgment, and also in terms of the strategies used to help people, rather than seeing it as a comparison to a kind of idealized idea of normalcy. It's taking the autistic way of being and working with that. So it's a theory of autism I particularly like. And if you compare it to something like executive functioning theory, that theory just sees everything in a negative as compared to other people. And I think this theory highlights some of the strengths and challenges that autistic people face. So I find it a useful one.
Thank you, Damian. So I see that part of your title is diversity, or when it comes to autism is neurodiversity. So what is meant by neurodiversity? And I'd like you to talk to us about how this is linked to a social model of disability.
The term neurodiversity is now over 20 years old. It was coined by an Australian autistic sociologist called Judy Singer. And the notion is based on around the idea of biodiversity as an analogy. So just like there's lots of different creatures in the world, there's lots of different brains in the way we develop, and we all develop somewhat uniquely. And neurodiversity is about everyone. So so-called neurotypical people are part of neurodiversity too. As a simple idea, it's a kind of to say we're all variations on a theme, if you like. We're all human, but our brains develop differently, and we have different strengths and difficulties because of that. And this relates quite strongly, though, the wider neurodiversity movement and concepts relating to it relate strongly to a social model of disability. And a social model of disability does not deny embodied differences or impairments, say, that someone might have, but it puts it within a social context. So the difficulties one faces is not just centered on the individual within them, but it's an issue for all of us, in a sense. So the social model has been promoted by disability activists of all kinds for a very long time. It originated in the 1970s. But it's really to take disability out of just seeing it as individual problem to be remediated in some way, and puts it more on a social footing. So changes in the environment which can help aid accessibility. So obvious examples of a social model being implemented would be ramps to a building or automatic doors. And it may be a bit trickier to apply to autism, but I think autism very much needs to be seen within its social context. My background's originally as a sociologist, so I have a bit of a bias that way.
Yeah. So I mean, so you suggest that we need to move from autism awareness to autism acceptance in a way. So what exactly do you mean by this? And it's also part of your title, Dave. So what exactly do you mean by this? And it's also part of your title.
Yeah. Well, we're within Autism Awareness Month, or just after Autism Awareness Day, which was the 2nd of April. And this was set up to raise awareness of autism. But the way this is done often reflects this more medical model or deficit model. And what are we raising awareness of? And everyone, I would say, has probably heard of autism now. People are aware of this thing, but people don't necessarily understand it well. And the term autism acceptance came from autistic activists and advocates themselves as a way of moving away from just raising awareness of autism to accepting autistic ways of being, rather than seeing them as something broken in need of fixing, if you like. So there's many autistic adults now prefer the term autism acceptance or acceptance day and so on. So it's, again, using that more social model of disability.
Yeah, so it all makes sense, yeah. Major part of your research has focused on, and I had a look at this during my own research, is looking at the double empathy problem. And since you published that paper, it has been used by many other researchers, autistic communities, everyone, at least in UK, I don't know about other parts of the world. So what exactly is that double empathy problem? Hello?
I think, oh, I forgot to
Hello?
unmute.
Well, the double
Yeah.
empathy problem, the double empathy problem was a phrase I came up with many years ago originally when I was helping out with a parent group for parents of autistic children. And it was partly a reaction to the theory of mind hypothesis of autistic problems in social interaction. And the theory of mind idea suggests that autistic people have a deficit or a problem in understanding the thoughts and feelings of others. And when I came across this theory, I saw it as quite a partial one in a sense, because one of the very common feelings amongst autistic people is a lack of understanding of their ways of being from others. So this empathy problem is a bi-directional. So if it was so easy to empathize with autistic ways of being, we wouldn't need events such as this. We wouldn't need books written about it. Calling autism an enigma by one famous author, Uta Frith, once called it. And so to me, this people of very differing dispositions or ways of perceiving the world are going to struggle understanding what it's like for one another. So I call it a double problem because it's a problem for both parties, as it were, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
great, yeah. Yeah, if we take for granted that autistic people have different needs, there is a diversity of needs of the autistic population. What suggestions do you have to make to people working with them, being specialists, professionals, psychologists, or even educators or therapists? So what are your suggestions to those people?
Well, due to the quite large diversity of autistic people and the strengths and difficulties they have, it really takes a very personalized approach. So avoiding a one-size-fits-all kind of view of autism or autistic people and what might help them. And the monotropism model in looking at interests and so on is very useful in this, because someone's interests or avoidances may be in complete contrast to the next autistic person. And I could give you plenty of examples. For me, I tried horse riding once as a child and nearly fell off, and I've never tried it again. And so I just put the barriers up, avoid, avoid, avoid. But my son, on the other hand, loves it. It's one of his favorite activities, and he'd quite happily do it every day if he could. And so when it comes to working with autistic people, one really has to look at their interests, where their attention is, and start there. And a bit less on trying to normalize people into acting less autistic. It really takes humility and effort to get to know that individual and their quirks, their likes and dislikes. There are certain common factors that need to be taken into account, though. Things like sensory perceptual differences and so on, and how the double empathy problem is likely to be an issue. So personalization, not normalization, is a catchphrase I use a lot. But also being humble in one's approach. So for my son, he has very few words, and it takes, say, a new professional, I would say on average takes about 6 months to get the basics of rapport going with him. And sometimes even then it doesn't quite happen. And it really takes as much effort as the autistic person's putting in to try and understand the world coming back in return. One practitioner I very much like is Phoebe Caldwell, and she has a number of YouTube videos and clips which you can look up. And she does a lot of work with autistic people with significant learning disabilities, such as my son. And it's really about getting into the space, the world of that person and working with that. So start where the person's at rather than trying to force them into something they're uncomfortable with, really.
It's quite challenging, and most of the time it needs like a multidisciplinary kind of team to actually address all the needs of those populations. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay. So, myth or reality that autistic people have an affinity for technology? I mean, from your research perspective and from your personal perspective, what do you have to say on this?
A bit of both, really. It's a bit of a stereotype that all autistic people will have an affinity with technology. And it somewhat comes from the 1990s, because when autistic people first started connecting with each other, this was in the very early days of the internet and things like this. And many of the early advocates and autistic voices that started to appear tended to have quite an affinity and interest in technology. And it is a common thing amongst the autistic community. However, there's quite a few autistic people who struggle with technology too. And a few years back, the National Autistic Society in the UK did a survey of what kinds of employment autistic people would like if they could get it. And 10% said computing and technology, which was the second highest kind of category to choose of the ones to choose from. But the one that came out top with 11 or 12% was work in arts and performing arts. And one wouldn't necessarily think of autistic people being artists or performing artists, but this is actually a stronger interest than people might think within the community. That said, I feel the internet and various technologies have been quite fundamental in the growth of autistic communities and autistic culture generally, because often we weren't aware of other autistic people, so sometimes the first people we encountered, knowing they were autistic too, were online. So the first autistic person I contacted knowingly was someone called Jim Sinclair, who was one of the sort of very early pioneers of autistic self-advocacy. And from that, I joined an online forum which was called Autistic Network International, ANI list. And so in the early days, we were on sort of email forums and things like this. But now I can see there's a very strong community on social media and various mediums and so on. So it's a kind of yes and no with regards to technology, and some with very strong interest indeed, and some who struggle with it.
Okay. Now, I think this is your first time you present in virtual reality. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, that's true. So now that you saw the whole process, yeah. Do you think that those virtual world? Oh, sorry.
I have
Okay.
used virtual reality such as Second Life before, but this is the first time I've used this platform, and I think it's quite a good one. It's I've only just started, as you know, but I think this is an interesting way of getting people together, and one which might suit autistic people well once they get the hang of the technology. So in face-to-face social interactions can be a great deal to process at any one time. So if you think of that monotropic attention and interest, for me, it can mean when there's a lot going on, I tend to use one sense at a time, or channel in a sense. So an example would be eye contact. A lot of autistic people don't give a lot of eye contact. And for me, if I'm looking at someone's face and trying to read their facial expressions and so on, it means I probably won't be listening to a word they say, because it's hard to process both at the same time and what I'm supposed to respond with. So simplifying the kind of non-verbal communication with emojis and signals like that is quite useful in a way, and we can concentrate more on the content of what we're saying and hearing.
Yeah, that's great. In terms of accessibility, what do you think somebody should add? What should the affordances be of those virtual worlds when it comes to accessibility for autistic users?
Well, just as user-friendly as possible, which I think this platform is quite user-friendly, with the tutorials on getting started and the navigation system. And perhaps for those who are struggling a bit more with it, if people could support them into this environment, I think that would work well. And yeah, I think people would have a lot of fun as well. I haven't tried the headset thing yet, but I'd like to give that a go at some point. And so, yeah, I think it could be an interesting way of autistic people using such a space. It's giving me ideas already about some of the networks and groups I'm involved with and events. And especially in the current situation, we may be needing more online events. So, yeah, I think it's got a lot of potential for us.
Yeah, I think VR now will almost become a daily necessity as a means of communication due to the COVID-19 action and the self-isolation status that we are all in now. I think that is all in terms of the interview. Thank you, Damian, very much. And now Damian is available for any questions you may have. So I'm going to allow hand raises and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, I see Georgiana, is that correct? Okay, I turn on the megaphone. So Georgiana, could you please talk? Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, we can all hear you.
So I was trouble hearing a couple things. So you said you're a father who has a child with autism? Okay, all right. I want to picture myself. And if you need to talk to somebody, I'm here. That's all.
It's breaking up a little, Georgiana. I just hear
Can you hear me?
some parts. Yeah, now, yeah.
Okay,
Can you try
testing,
again? Yeah.
testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Talk to you, I'm here, so I understand completely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Georgiana. Okay. Data, is this data? Yeah.
Yes, Data, thank you very much.
Okay.
And Damian, thank you for what you are saying. I'm a psychologist also, so I'm working with children with autism, and for me it was really interesting what you were saying about eye contact, and what it made me think about also is reaction to a new space, because what I see frequently when I'm working with the children, when they come for the first time, it's really difficult for them to adapt and to accept new place. How is it in this world? Is it different to accept, for example, this area, or how do you feel? And maybe you can imagine better than me.
Could you repeat the question? It was breaking up a little bit.
Data, could you? Yeah, okay. You're good
Thank
to
you.
go.
I was not having, I was not having a microphone. Yes, my question is about reaction to the new space. Is it easier to adapt in virtual reality world to this space rather than in real world? As I saw in my practice, that frequently children were really scared when they were coming in, and maybe there are some other points which you see which could be.
Okay, I think I caught some of that. I think when in new spaces or new activities or kind of new anything can be a problem. One of the common features of, I think, between all theories of autism can be this problem with predictability, or predicting what's going to happen next. And so new environments, new activities and so on can be quite stressful and anxiety raising, especially for autistic people. And so it can be very difficult the first time someone enters into an environment. One of the advantages, I think, with this virtual reality environment is someone could get used to it at their own pace. So one could explore the world without having to interact with anyone, really, and just play with it. And then, so one could start getting a more predictable environment, in a sense, for themselves. Another thing is it taps into potential interests that are already there. So a lot of young people will already be using computer games or online mediums, and a lot of autistic children communicate quite well with each other and other children over games like Minecraft and different platforms like that. And a lot of us are quite keen gamers. So I think a virtual reality environment could be one which perhaps is less scary for people, especially if there's help for when needed. But generally, making things more predictable for people generally helps. And also tapping into people's interests and likes. So another thing that helps is whatever brings that sense of trust and predictability. So my son, for example, is quite good with new environments if he has me with him. So his trust and predictability comes from my presence of being there with him, if that makes sense. So yeah, it can be a difficult problem, as I'm sure you found out, but there are ways of mitigating against that somewhat.
Great, thank you, Damian, thank you. Another question from Rael.
So thank you so much for being here, in spite of the crazy at the beginning. You've given us some perspectives from the point of view of the environment of creating worlds and spaces, but what about individuals here in VR who meet someone, we don't want to walk up and say, are you autistic, or have somebody say, hey, I'm autistic, and then what do we do? But how do we create relationships? What are some tips that help us bond with people and emotionally support them?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I think it's be different for different people. It might be good to have autistic-led virtual reality spaces. I know that sometimes when in face-to-face events and interactions, when they're being led by autistic people with those needs being paramount, this often makes environments more easy to deal with. I go usually to a yearly conference in the UK that's organised by autistic adults called Autscape, and it's probably the environment most suited to my needs and interests any I've come across. And so, and I know years ago there used to be autistic-led spaces in Second Life and so on. And very early on in this kind of technology, there were autistic people setting up and building environments and so on. So having some spaces which are kind of led by autistic people would perhaps be a nice kind of meeting space for people. I'm not sure that answers your question.
It does beautifully, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Damian. So, Georgiana, another question?
Sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh, okay. Are there any other questions addressed to Damian?
I have one more, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
When you're on the spectrum, and then your son is, and there's a lot of of talk about it being inherited and genetic. And I'm just wondering, what was your position on that?
Well, the evidence would suggest there is a large genetic component. That doesn't necessarily mean that it runs in families. It can be a kind of genetic mutation, if you like, but probably multiple genes are involved. I'm not an expert on genetics, but you often do find more than one autistic person or neurodivergent person, at least within a family. There's quite a few in mine. My first cousin is also on the spectrum, was diagnosed around the same time I was. And my father is quite similar to me in many ways. And his father, looking back, I think, was quite certainly on the spectrum. And I think you will find some families where it's quite common within that family, and others where there hasn't been any history at all. So it's a bit of a difficult one, that, but I think there is a large genetic component. But it's a rather complex one. So there isn't one particular gene which denotes autism or a biomarker that anyone has found. And so it's probably a lot more complicated, and that's why I like neurodiversity as a term, because it's quite hard to form concrete categories around these areas. And it's Lorna Wing, who is one of the pioneers of autism research and practice, once said, nature never draws a line without smudging it, which I found quite a useful phrase when it came to these categories.
That's great. Thank you, Damian. Thank you. Another question from Data.
Yeah, it's more an answer on previous question. Like quite recently, before lockdown in my city, I was in a conference. It was a French professor who is currently studying exactly this question, and he found about his laboratory about a half a year ago has found exactly 3 genes which are responsible for the mutation. Which are provoking difference. For example, Asperger is 1 gene, and other types are another 2, 1. I cannot title them exactly because it's just random titles, but there is such a research about this topic, and there is such a confirmation about that. Actually, it's related to the mutation.
You can
Are you
unmute
there,
yourself.
Damian?
There you go.
Okay.
Some of that was breaking up again.
Okay. Would you like Data to repeat the question, Damian? Did you hear Data's question, or would you like her to repeat it?
I will repeat it shortly.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Damian, what I was saying, maybe I can be a bit more calmer. What I was saying is that recently I was participating in a conference related to the autism, and there was one of the research group which was presenting exactly about the topic of the previous question. I don't know who exactly was asking it, but there is some confirmation that there are 3 genes which were found, which are corresponding to the mutation of like different autism mutation. For example, one of the genes is corresponding to Asperger syndrome, others to others. It's not really a question. It's just if someone is interested, you can find this research on the internet and read a bit deeper. There is also a laboratory and hospital which is helping exactly people with difficult forms of autism to be a bit more adaptive. Yeah, that's all what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
I hope you heard me now.
Yeah, I heard it better that time. I think when it comes to the genetics, there's still a lot more research to be done, because different researchers have come up with different genes that may be playing a part, and or for aspects of autistic traits and so on. As I said, I'm not an expert in the genetics area, but there is a lot of work happening in this area, and no doubt that will continue, because it seems to be more complicated than people first imagined. So, yeah, a lot of work to be done, I guess.
Thank you, Damian. Any more questions? There's one question. Okay, Laurel, yeah.
Where do you think the future is going to go for you in your research and in the work that you're doing? So what's ahead of you?
I just teleported. I'll just come back now.
I warned you about that, so good for Damian. Yay, bravo.
Yeah, I'm currently I'm currently involved in a couple of research projects at the moment, which are very different from one another. One project's about the sensory needs and preferences of autistic people with higher support needs within care home type settings. So we're looking at different assessment methods and ways of improving sensory environments to make them more accessible and more autism friendly, if you like, and less problematic for people. And I think there's been a lot of recent research into sensory perceptual issues, but far less in transferring that into practice or how one would implement changes. So that's one of the projects I'm currently working on, although the current lockdown has impacted that project a bit in our data collection, unfortunately. And another project I'm working on is quite different, is one with some colleagues, which is about autism in media representations and autism in film. And at the end of that project, we're hoping to kind of produce a film with some autistic young people, following their interests and what they want to do with the film. So quite a different project, but I think a very interesting one. A lot of the projects I get involved with have quite a practical aspect to them. One of the projects I was involved in fairly recently was around mentoring young autistic adults. and a very kind of personalised, person-centred mentoring scheme. And we trained the mentors up with an autistic-led training package. And that was quite a successful pilot study, and for the young people whose mentor relationships worked well, it tended to work very well and was very beneficial. So I like to do projects where the participants are going to be gaining from the experience itself and participatory research. So I'm currently chair of a group called the Participatory Autism Research Collective, or PARC for short. We have our own website, and it's mainly to share research and ideas and to promote autistic-led work or participatory research in the field. And that's one of my main drives at the moment, is building that network up and encouraging more autistic people into research as well. One of the sad things is we had a whole kind of series of events planned for this year, live events and workshops and so on. And we've had to cancel or postpone all of them. So this is one of the things I've been talking to Anna about the last couple of days, is workshops and events in virtual reality like this, and how that could benefit the PARC network.
Great ideas, Damian. You've got great ideas. I'm in the same line of thinking as you are. So we've got a couple of minutes. Is Georgian actually want to ask a question, or is it random? Okay. Okay,
So-
you're on, Georgian.
I am? Okay, so first
Yeah.
of all, person I am who has autism, I am so honorable and inspired to have met you. And I really appreciate that you are encouraging people who are on the spectrum to research, to do research, Dr. Milton. How is that going for you?
Sorry, what was the question at the end?
How is it going for you? Like, wait, pronounce this. You actually, here's the big question: how many places have you been speaking at? Have you spoken at?
Okay. A lot. Probably hundreds over the years. I've been very busy over the last decade talking at events and conferences and workshops and training programs, doing written work and interviews. And I think it's very important for that autistic voice to be out there, and autistic researchers to be sharing their work and being listened to. That's part of the PARC group, and what I'm trying to do there is encourage others and create spaces for lots of autistic people to be heard and to share their ideas and their knowledge, really. So it's something I'd encourage people to do if they're able to.
Dr. Milton, that is absolutely amazing.
So
Well,
I
thank
think we
you.
have.
Nice to hear too.
So it's 9:01. Thank you, Damian. Thank you very much. We've been honored having you today. And thank you everybody for attending and for your very constructive questions. I think it was a great session. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It was amazing.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Milton.
I can unmute all now, so